I'm Dan Kaplan, Online Content Manager at Trustwave, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Carl Sigler, who is our Threat Intelligence Manager, and we're going to be talking about indicators of compromise. Carl, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your time.
Carl, you recently wrote a column for the Huffington Post, which was published there. It was titled, "So You Think You've Been Breached." Your article talked a lot about some of the signs of compromise, and let's start with one of the pretty alarming stats that you note prior to getting into those signs, and that's taken from our 2014 Trustwave Global Security Report, and that said that 71% of businesses failed to detect a breach themselves. Now, that is a high number. Why do you think that number is so high, Carl?
It's a hard problem. It really is. A lot of organizations just don't have either the people resources, or if they have the people, if they have the human resources, those resources don't have the skill set. So, organizations, they've gotten a lot better at response. That exact same report that you mentioned showed that we've gotten very good at after detection of sort of containing the breach or compromise. But the initial detection, it's a hard problem. You've got to set up an infrastructure, you've got to be monitoring logs, and you also need to know what to look for. And a lot of organizations just don't have that infrastructure set up.
So how are these companies finding out that they've been breached in most cases?
Usually it's going to be third-party notifications. They're going to have law enforcement potentially, maybe a regulation company, regulatory organization, potentially even their own bank that's letting them know, hey, we've seen that you've been compromised. So they're not finding it out themselves. They have to wait until one of the other organizations outside of them discovers it and lets them know.
And this problem ranges from the small organizations up to the big ones. I mean, I would assume that the larger companies that are operating the really proficient networks are able to detect a breach, but is that always the case?
It's not always the case. It's pretty much widespread. Whether you're small, medium, or large, all of these organizations are facing sort of the same problems. The larger you are, the more complex your networks are going to be, the harder that notification is going to be to get in, even if you have those resources. The smaller you are, the more limited you are with those resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, let's get into some of these signs of compromise here. You list 7. Let me read them off quickly. Changes in web behavior, evidence of tampering with antivirus services, your computer is acting on its own, always a big sign there, geographic changes in login, strange account activity, unexplained or suspicious outbound data, and evidence of log tampering. So are any of those more likely to occur than some of the others?
It really depends. It depends on the actual compromise itself. Things like odd web behavior, for instance, you're seeing new toolbars in your web browser. Your search engine has suddenly changed. If you were using Google or Yahoo, suddenly your browser is going to a different search engine. That would be very typical of sort of a consumer or an individual breach. And this is what you would probably want your employees to look for. Some of the other ones that you mentioned, things like geographic change in login. That would be more typical of a wider breach, a more organizational breach. And that's where you're going to be dependent on your security infrastructure and your security personnel to alert you to those things. That wouldn't be something your regular employees would necessarily see.
Compromise, is it necessary, because it happens so often, is it necessarily a death sentence? I mean, if you catch it early enough, is it the worst day on earth? Or if you catch it quickly enough, are you able to push back those attackers who certainly don't want to meet any resistance, right? They want that least path of resistance to get to what they're looking for. And if they sense that someone has caught onto them, has discovered them, they might say, okay, this isn't worth it.
Sure. I mean, the sooner you can detect a breach, the more you're going to be limiting damage. We always say that it's a when, not an if type scenario. The chances of you getting breached are very, very high. It's just a risk that we all accept in this day and age. And it's just, it should be considered like server downtime. Nobody suggests that a server is going to be up 100% of the time. You're going to have some downtime, and you need to have procedures and processes in place to deal with that sort of outage. Having a compromise is not the end of the world, and it shouldn't be seen as such. It's just part of doing business, and the more you have procedures in place to identify the breach yourself, the more you're going to be able to minimize the damage, and the quicker you're going to be able to recover from the breach.
Yeah. Okay, well, Carl, thank you for being with us today. Certainly great advice. And we are seeing that number drop a little bit, but still 71% of businesses that are failing to detect the breach themselves is an alarming number, as I mentioned, but hopefully we'll see that drop, and hopefully they can implement some of the advice that you provided today. So Carl Sigler, Trustwave's Threat Intelligence Manager, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Appreciate your time.